So one of the things I really love about doing these television series on Mondays and Tuesdays, and I've loved this for the past couple of years as I've been going through Voyager, is it gives me a great avenue to talk about the creative process. I've kind of brought this up before, I've been talking about all sorts of aspects of writing and acting and directing and the things that go on behind the scenes, how a producer works, how television works, the concept of teasers, philosophy with regards to marketing, with regards to presentation, just tons and tons and tons of stuff. It's been great talking about it. It's actually a little bit funny in its own right, because that's actually one of the biggest reasons why my Babylon 5 videos are almost universally shorter than most of my older Voyager videos, because I already covered that material in my Voyager stuff, so I don't really feel the need to recover it, obviously. But I finally have something to talk about here in Bab 5 that I have never had to talk about in Voyager. Extras. I know what you're thinking. Hmm? One of the most common things, I shouldn't say it that way. One of the things that is most commonly not acknowledged about a creative process is the people behind the scenes, the people behind the camera, as we like to call it. Obviously, all the attention and all the focus is on the actors. Sometimes it's also on the directors, sometimes it's also on the writers, but it's like, it goes in that order. Actors, directors, writers. As far as most common people are considered, this is true for television and movies both, by the way. They look at that and they're like, yeah, that's a great actor. And they don't really acknowledge, I don't mean this as an insult, but most people don't acknowledge or even understand how many other people go into that performance. How much else goes into it. One of the most common phrases, this is what I was going to lead with, that I've heard is you can tell visual and audio design is doing its job properly if you don't notice it. And that's kind of true. The point being that if it's being operated on smoothly, if it's being done properly, you're not really supposed to mentally notice it. It's not supposed to look off or sound off. The Sega presentation at the Sonic 25th Anniversary is a good example of how to do that completely wrong, for example. But you get my point, right? If anything was off with the audio or with the video, you'd notice it. So you generally don't notice it if it's right. Make sense? And there's a whole sorts of stuff that goes into this. The motion thing. There's a reason I have motion backgrounds rather than static backgrounds, for example. If this is a picture, you'd notice it. It would look off. And I've demonstrated this live on stream before, for those of you not aware of what I mean. But what I want to talk about here is something that Voyager has never really used. In fact, arguably, Star Trek in general has rarely used what I'm about to talk about. Not counting the movies, of course. Extras. Now, Bab 5 has done this up to this point in time, but this is the episode I've kind of been saving this discussion for, because this is where it really comes to the forefront. There are tons, dozens of extras in every scene. Of course there are. There's 25 freaking thousand troops on that station. And I do like the fact that they emphasize in dialogue and story just how large that is. That is a freaking army. That is, in standard Imperial terms, 2 full corps, to give you an idea. Which actually is not a full army. A full army would be 4 corps. But you get the point. That's a huge force. Especially by the standards of Babylon 5. And they get that across, visually. You probably aren't, again, you're not really supposed to notice it, but good extra work is one of those things that doesn't really receive a lot of attention when it comes to television and movie production. But extras are absolutely mandatory and frankly necessary for good television and movies both, in my opinion. And this episode does it, just does it absolutely amazing. There's tons and tons of them. You really get the feeling of the station being busier than usual. You really get the feeling of the amount of troops that are everywhere. It's very well done. Huge props. To give you an idea what I'm talking about with regard to this, I actually had an entire section of the Star Trek TV show I was working on that got torpedoed. And this entire section was devoted solely towards, okay, here's what I need for the extras side of things. Because I understand that, having looked at this before and analyzed this before, and I understood that extras were going to be critical, vital even, to the overall presentation of my show, given how large scale it was supposed to feel. I mean, the ship they were on was basically a colony ship, not a standard explorative or military ship or a station. So lots of people all the time, especially after certain incidents happened after Season 1. So Yeah, it was absolutely mandatory to have a huge amount of extras at any given point in time. And then you could play with that too. Like, for example, I was going to have a couple of major characters first be in the show as extras. No lines, no dialogue, just in the background, like all the rest of the extras. As kind of a bonus point. A, for anybody who's paying attention, and B, because it makes sense, because they would be in the background just like everyone else until the camera focused on them, so to speak. There's more going on than just what the camera sees, after all, was the overall point of that. The second thing I want to say about this episode is that Paul Winfield is amazing. It's always great to see him on display. I've always been a big fan of Paul Winfield's, which is a damn shame, that he's, yeah. But it was great. Paul Winfield absolutely nails the role, and he plays a very interesting general, because on the one hand, he is initially portrayed as if he is your typical military general. Your typical, rah, war, and usually portrayed as an idiot. The same thing usually applies to admirals, and in fact, to bring Star Trek into this, how many admirals can you name in Star Trek who are not idiots? Because they're the exceptions. There are a few. I actually can't remember his name, but there's Admiral What's-His-Face in DS9. He was Ross, Admiral Ross in DS9. He was a recurring figure. I'm sure there's others. The point being, it's a common trope in fiction to portray an upper echelon of a military as basically a moron. And initially, they're slanting it like it's that way, but it becomes pretty clear pretty soon after that he's not. And I love it because he never comes out and says, well, I'm not an idiot. He just slowly shifts his presentation as he warms up to Sheridan and as he warms up to his son. We start to see the man underneath, the mask, if you will, there. We see a person, definitely a career officer, definitely someone who believes in the concept of military. And yet at the same time, someone who has layers to him, someone who has complexities to him, someone who, as much as he believes in military service, understands the needs and costs of that service. There's this line which is actually brilliant. I forget how it is. Forgive me, I didn't write it down, but I'm paraphrasing here. Everyone should be intelligent enough to take orders from someone else. That's actually a great line, because the whole point is, and this is brilliantly subtle, the smarter you are, this is true in real life, the smarter you are about a particular subject, the more you realize how little you know about it. Probably this is nowhere is this more true than in physics or other hard sciences here in real life, like medical science. The truly brilliant surgeons, doctors, nurses, pharmacists understand how little they actually know about it. That's usually one of the hall signs. And I don't mean it's not just saying, well, I don't know anything about that. That doesn't make you smart. It's actually understanding how little you know about your topic. That's the sign of it. So I love the way they present that. I also really like how it's made very clear that he straddles the line between your service is expected and yet at the same time it is lamentable. Sheridan is actually the one who says the line, soldiers, I forget how he says. Sheridan says the line. I keep forgetting specific. I just watched this episode. A soldier's job is death. There's no escaping it. There's no avoiding it. The best we can do is hope that was for a good reason. But then the general later says, death is part of a soldier's life, but we tend to forget that it's also part of our families' lives as well. And you could see how he's straddling the line there between, this is my job and I'm not going to shirk from it. He says that flat out, and for reasons I'll go into in a moment. And yet at the same time, it is clear that in his honest opinion, if given his choice, he would not choose this. This is, in fact, he says twice in this episode, not directly, but indirectly, I don't have a choice, but this is my duty. This is my responsibility. This is my calling. This is what I am here for. And so it's a rare balance. And again, huge credit to Paul Winfield for straddling that line between career officer who regrets being a career officer while at the same time embracing it. I don't know how better to put it. He really nails the balance there. 25,000 troops. So I mentioned earlier that that's a ridiculous number of troops. I don't know if you fully understand how much of a problem that would be, especially since these are grunts. I'll talk more about that in a moment. In Babylon 5, grunts are actually referred to as Gropos, but again, I'll get into that moment. Ground pounders, for those of you not aware of the analogy or the acronym. But 25,000 military fighting men and women. I do like that there's as many men and women equally. You know, I like that. It's a nice touch. But 25,000 troops, that's insane. I don't even have words to explain how insane that is. I'm a little amazed that we see as little altercations as there are. I mean, it's hinted a few times that there's other altercations going on in the other rest of the station, but that's a mess. Never mind trying to keep it quiet. I am actually astonished they managed to keep that quiet at all. I really am. If this was my setting, I would have had so many different spy / under the market organizations looking at it and saying, "Oh, okay," because really. And the fact that even the soldiers could say, "No, we're not going to IO." They're not going to say anything about it, but we're not going to IO. You know, that kind of stuff. But all those people interacting with lots and lots of alien races, and in a station that's not really built for that kind of quantity, in a station that's not built to be a military hub, I could honestly just sit here and talk for about half an hour about all the problems that dropping 25,000 troops on Babylon 5 is. And I think they do a good job of handling how much of an issue it is, even for just a few days. Let's talk about the Gropos grunts thing. Now, I want to make one thing very, 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 very clear. I do not use the term grunt as an insult, any more than they use the term Gropos, or ground pounder, as an insult, okay? It is actually a sign of respect. This was taught to be by a Marine, actually. Funny little factoid, just really quick. Most of the people I've known in real life who have been in the Navy or the Air Force have been male, but most of the people I've known who've been in the Army and in the Marines have been female. Just a little funny anecdote, but that'll be relevant in a moment because I'm going to segue this into talking about Dodger. But before we talk about Dodger, let's talk about the Gropos grunt thing. First of all, this episode does a really good job of portraying them. Notice how the drunk, I'm going to cause a fight ground pounder, who is portrayed as the antagonist ground pounder, he gets into the fight with Dodger, Dodger kicks his ass, and then the sergeant comes over and says, "Who started it?" Neither rats out the other. Did you notice that? I wanted to applaud at that. I know it's a small thing, but that is so accurate. Whatever disagreements, whatever arguments, whatever literal physical damage done between the two, those are troops, grunts, ground pounders. Whatever term you want to use, it means the same thing. There is a form of bond that exists between people who literally fight and die on the ground, in the trenches, on the front lines, that no other term has ever explained. And that's why I use the term grunt, and they use the term ground pounder, not as an insult. Ivanova uses an insult in this episode. She says jarheads. That's a little more of an insulting term. But ground pounder and grunt, that's a sign of respect. And again, I have been taught this from people in the military, from people in the Army, and from people in the Marines. They say, yes, hell yes, we're a grunt. Hell yes, we're a ground pounder. Hell yes, we're the frontline trench heads, or whatever other term. There's a bunch of other terms I'm not going to mention here because I try to avoid cussing on my show. But you get the point. There's a bunch of terms for that kind of thing. But it all comes down to the one I've stuck to for most of my life, grunts. No one else really goes through what they do. It's often said the good officers understand the cost that the people under them go through. Good leaders in general understand the cost of their orders. Like Sean Bean in Game of Thrones. But in all seriousness, no one pays what they do. No one pays what the grunts do. Other people go through hell and back. Other people do suffer in ways, in more than a few ways. It's not a cakewalk, serving on a ship, for example, or being a fighter pilot or anything like that. But no one goes through what the grunts go through, and they know it. And everyone who has a brain knows it. Whatever ire may be put at a nation, whatever ire may be put at leaders or doctrines or whatever political policy is currently going on, my respect has always been out there for grunts, regardless of nation. Now, not every soldier is a grunt, it is worth noting, but I don't want to get too much into that, and I'd rather not start talking about that on this show. Because what I want to talk about instead is how grunts are actually dwarves. Now, think about it for a moment. One of the things I've always liked about dwarves, as they're usually portrayed, but my favorite portrayals being The Lord of the Rings and, obviously, and Warcraft are my two favorite portrayals of dwarves. They are quick to anger, quick to fight, quick to forgive, and quick to become friends immediately afterwards. I've actually struggled at defining dwarves over the years, but ultimately I think I've come up with a term because it was made very clear in this episode. They love life. They just embrace it. They go full tilt into whatever it is they're doing with tons of enthusiasm and tons of energy, and they may hold a bit of a grudge, but that grudge will only last until the very moment something occurs that allows them to forgive it, and then BAM! It's gone. There is no grudge left, and all of a sudden we go from being enemies or whatever to being best friends. This episode actually demonstrates that great. More than once, actually, but my favorite portrayal is right towards the beginning when I forget his name, Skyboy. I forget what they call him. They have a term for it, but the fighter pilot guy whose name I can't remember goes in and he sees the grunts, the Gropos there, and he's being kind of rude-ish to them. If you really, I mean, not that I blame him, but the Gropos were being fairly amiable. Hey, yeah, what's up? He was being kind of rude, so they're standing up like, all right, you want to make something of it? And then the guy says, yeah, you're going to need to get me a ladder. And then he's like, yeah, you're all right. And then they just start, boom, gone. All that, any irritation, any frustration, it's gone. It's thrown out the window. That's a Gropos. That's a grunt right there. And I love that presentation. And we do see some good and we do see some bad in that. For example, the fact that Dodger was more than willing to stand up for a civilian. If there's... I mean, duh, right? Never mind that the civilian was a Minbari. Never mind that the civilian was frickin' Delenn. Just, she was willing to stand up for a civilian. Good Gropo. And then we see the bad Gropo, the drunk, who instigates two fights that we see on camera. One with Dodger by going after Delenn, and one with everyone in the bar brawl towards the end. Both of those show the gamut, because obviously not every grunt has earned the respect that is implied within the term grunt. Like him, for example. And then they give new top-of-the-line weapons to Babylon 5. Credit where credit is due. This is smart for two reasons. First, they explain why these weapons are good. They're not just, super omega cannons. They're better tracking, is specifically something that's mentioned. And they have, faster point defense, and a few other little details that are tossed out that actually explain why they're better, rather than just saying, we have upgraded to something of a higher item level, The second reason it's smart is from a writing perspective. Babylon 5 can now defend itself. Think about that for a moment. Just think about it for a moment. If you remember, DS9 actually pulled a similar trick, but a little less subtly. Not that I'm insulting DS9, but in DS9, in The Way of the Warrior, Deep Space Nine had been building up new military defenses for other reasons and then ended up having to use them, and it was awesome. But this is more subtle because Babylon 5 isn't using those defenses in this. I don't think it's spoiling to say they will be using those new weapons in the future. But obviously, sliding this in early on as part of a military venture because they want Babylon 5 to be a military outpost for Earth Force projected power into this sector as a result of the Narn Centauri War, that's quiet. And it's not quiet. It's actually pretty obvious, if I'm being honest. But it's a smart way to slide it in and have that piece ready to go for when you need it later. Speaking of the Narn Centauri War, it's actually mentioned exactly twice in this episode. But it's funny because the Narn Centauri War is why this episode happens. And I like that. I like the fact that the events of the previous episode have an impact on this one, and I like the fact that in this episode we see very, very clearly that the Narn Centauri War is going to have a long-term, large-scale impact on the galaxy, because it should. These are two of the strongest military powers, economic powers, strongest galactic powers in the known galaxy. It makes perfect sense that they're going to war with each other would have a huge impact on everyone else, just like it would in real life. Imagine for a moment right now if the entirety of the EU and China went to war right now. Just bam. Wouldn't that have an impact on the entire planet? Trust me, it would. I assure you it would. Even from a, of course, you guys know me and my economic love lust of economy and economics, but even from a purely economic perspective, that would shift everything globally. Same thing here. And it's wonderful because it helps to tie in with what with two other things. It's a smart way to keep the Narn Centauri thing relevant. It's a smart thing because it directly leads into this episode. The entire episode happens because EarthGov is worried about the situation and knows they need to start getting allies and start getting militarily positioned for the inevitable, which will happen. I mean, there is no way they will not get dragged into this war. And it's a smart way to kind of talk about what's going on back home. It's very subtle, but we get little hints and tidbits here or there of what's happening back at EarthGov, of how Earth Force is changing. That'll come up next episode, so I don't want to talk about that too much here. But it is hinted at here. Now, I want to mention one other thing really quick. I love Dodger in this episode. The actress is great, the lines are great, the portrayal's great. She is exactly as rough around the edges and brutally honest and a grunt, with all respect intended, that she should be. She's probably the best portrayal of a grunt that I see in this entire episode, actually. Possibly the whole series. And it probably my favorite line to emphasize that is going to make you laugh and make fun of me, but she comes and she's like, hey, you want to show me around? Security chief, and he's like, okay, what would you like to see? A good restaurant, and then your quarters. I love that. And poor Garibaldi, of course, totally overwhelmed by that, because he hasn't been a ground pounder for a while, has he? He used to be. He understands that mindset, and he demonstrates that in this episode, especially when he goes to try and reconcile with her in the bar. He gets it. And yet, at the same time, he's moved beyond that now. He's settled. He doesn't have to worry about whether or not he's going to be alive tomorrow, like a grunt does. She gives a great speech about this. It's not even a speech, it's just a line. I'm a ground pounder. I may be cleaning latrines one day, and up to my hips in blood, hoping I don't hear the shot that ends me. That is the life of a ground pounder right there. It's a bit of an old story, but as I've said many, many times, cliches are not necessarily bad. There's two cliches in this episode. One is the families of soldiers, and two is that war is hell. In the first cliche, we see, I haven't really talked about this much. Honestly, I don't feel like there's much to talk about, which is why I haven't really covered it yet. I do love the interactions between Franklin and General Franklin. Really, really good stuff. Again, Paul Winfield knocks it out of the park, and the gentleman who plays Stephen Franklin, I actually can't remember his name right now, does a phenomenal job. And both of them just absolutely nail it. They really do. I love it. And I admit I actually teared up at several of the scenes between the two, most especially the last one, because one of the things they really touch on, and again, this is a cliche, they touch on two cliches in that, actually. One is the price that the families of soldiers pay. Franklin talks about more than once how he felt and how horrible it was to just wait. It's one of those quietly horrifying things I've talked about so many times. My favorite example is a Tyrannosaurus Rex. Bear with me. A Tyrannosaurus Rex is bearing down on you. That's horrifying. Ah! Now imagine that instead of a T-Rex, what you're doing is you're sitting here, unable to do anything, no obvious apparent threat like the T-Rex, no big obvious thing. All you're doing is just sitting here in a perfectly normal, ordinary life, knowing that at any moment your significant other or family member or friend may die. And it may be a while before you get news. You may never get news. He or she may just be MIA. Think about that for a moment. That's quietly horrifying. And it is the price that the loved ones of soldiers pay in real life, in addition to in fiction. And it should not be forgotten. The other cliche they touch on is the way family works. And I like this because it's brilliant. They don't really like each other. They have different perspectives, they are different people, and they disagree. But there is still an obvious connection of both respect and love between the two. And that is what my definition of family is. Love and respect despite differences. Because we are different people. And that kind of unity, well, it's kind of rare. And it's kind of awesome when it happens. The other cliche, of course, is that war is hell. What kind of show is Babylon 5? Babylon 5 is a show that will spend an entire episode really focusing on guest stars. And fleshing them out as characters. We see a lot of Dodger, again, the idealized grunt. We see the bad grunt. We see big grunt. I can't remember their names, forgive me. But, we get to see these characters. We get to know them. We get to interact with them. And they all die by the end of the episode. Every single one of them. The only one who doesn't die is the sergeant and the general. It works for many reasons. It works, first of all, because, and I hate myself for saying this, it is believable. I've always said that I prefer believability in my fiction, not realism. Big difference. But believability. You send 25,000 troops into a meat grinder. 25,000 people are not coming home from that. That's just fact. They never say it outright, but the death toll is implied to be pretty high. So how do you express that to your audience? Well, you could say, oh, we lost 4,000 people. What is 4,000 people to you? It's a number. Better to show the people, show the lives, show their interactions, and then that final camera pan of their dead bodies. No need to say it out loud. No need to get too obvious about it. The people you just saw are dead. That has impact. It brings that death, that cost of war, down to a personal level. The only way to make that more impacting would be, like, for example, killing off a main character in a similar sense. Having a main character who's been a major aspect of the show up till this point be one of the ones who dies as a result of the war. Obviously, that's a very risky and very dangerous thing, but that's my point. That's about the only thing you could do to be more impacting than what they did within the confines of television production. It's a very personal showcasing of war and how horrible war really is. Sheridan has the great quote that I've quoted many times in my life. There's only one certainty in war. People die. And the whole underlying undercurrent, which is never stated at all, but the undercurrent point here is, this is just the beginning. This was a proxy battle of Earth assisting an alien race to gain a foothold in preparation for the actual war. The war hasn't really reached us yet. The Narn and the Centauri are doing their thing over there. This is just the opening moves. And it's already this bad. Think about how much worse it'll get in the future. And that's what I like about this. This is always going to be a reminder of the cost as we move forward into the Narn Centauri War proper. I'll see you guys next time.